I want you to imagine the final days of the Civil War. The air was thick with smoke, and rumors of freedom moved faster than the wind. For the first time in generations, the chains of slavery were breaking, not just on paper, but in the minds and hearts of the people who carried them. Word spread across plantations like wildfire. We are free. When that message reached the fields, men and women didn't wait for instructions or guidance. They walked, they ran, they gathered their children, their elders, whatever they could carry, and they moved toward the promise of safety under the Union flag. And all those footsteps began converging on places like Natchez, Mississippi. Natchez had always been just a small river town resting on the bluffs above the Mississippi River. Nothing remarkable, but now it became a crossroad of hope. Some say the population jumped from just 10,000 to nearly 100,000 souls in a wave of desperation and belief. Whether that number is exact or not, I want you to feel what it means. The roads were full. The riverbanks were full. The fields outside the town were full. Everywhere, people newly freed were searching for life, barefoot, hungry, exhausted, but believing in something they had never touched before: freedom. They came because they trusted the Union Army would protect them. They came because the government had created something called the Freedmen's Bureau, meant to help former slaves begin again. But hope alone couldn't feed the crowds that arrived. The Union soldiers stationed there was already worn thin from years of war. They did not have the food. They did not have the shelter. They did not have the medicine. And Natchez was not the only place feeling this tidal wave. Camps like this were rising in more than 200 cities across the South. What began as a march towards freedom was slowly slipping into a struggle to stay alive. The streets couldn't hold everyone. Diseases began whispering through the crowds. Hunger followed it. In the city, pressured by the frightened white residents who did not want thousands of free black men and women moving freely through the streets, decided to push them away, to contain them, to separate them, to hide the crisis from sight. And that decision is what led thousands of the newly freed into a place that locals called the Devil's Punch Bowl. I want you to picture the land itself, the way the Mississippi River carves into the bluffs of Natchez, shaping the earth into a deep hollow bowl, a steep, sunken valley hidden beneath the cliffs. That place is called the Devil's Punch Bowl. From the top, the trees look calm, but below, the ground sinks into a pit, walls of rock and tangled forests rising on every side, a place where sound doesn't travel far, where the world seems to close in on itself. Long before the war ended, the Union Army already knew of this place. They had used it to hold thousands of enslaved people who escaped during the fighting. It was isolated, contained, and out of sight. So when the crowds of newly freed men, women, and children flooded Natchez in 1865, the Army made its choice. They forced them into the canyon, into the bowl. They put up barricades, stationed guards with rifles, and once the people were inside, they sealed the entrance. They called it a camp. But I want you to sit with the truth of what that means. Thousands of people who had just won their freedom were now being held behind armed lines, unable to leave, by the same army they believed would protect them. The white residents of Natchez, they didn't want the newly freed walking their streets. The Union soldiers didn't have the food, resources, or plans to care for everyone who had arrived, and sickness, especially smallpox, was already spreading like a shadow over the crowds. So instead of building safety, the army chose containment. It was easier. They told themselves it was necessary. They told themselves they were preventing unrest. They told themselves they were preventing diseases. But what they really created was a prison carved into the earth itself. Thousands of freed black men, women, and children who had walked miles, who had prayed, sung, and wept with joy at the first breath of freedom, now looked up at the rock walls that surrounded them and realized they were trapped. Hope began to unravel, confusion turned into fear. And freedom, the very thing they had risked everything to reach, now felt like a cruel trick played by the world itself. The stage was set, not for liberation, but for suffering unlike anything they could have imagined. When I tell you the Devil's Punch Bowl became hell on earth, I did not use those words lightly. Down in that pit, the sun did not feel like warmth. It felt like punishment. The air was thick, so thick you could almost chew it. The kind of heat that presses on your chest, makes your clothes cling to your skin, makes every breath feel borrowed. And inside that pit, thousands of families were living in it with no escape. They built what they could. Shacks made of broken wood, scraps of cloth, pieces of canvas, anything that could stand upright long enough to call itself shelter. A city of desperation thrown together at the bottom of the earth. No shade, no clean water, no relief. A young girl named Lizzie, who lived up on the hill overlooking the river, will later write in her diary about what she saw. She described flimsy huts and suffering so visible that she could barely stand to look at it. But for the people inside the pit, they could not look away. They were living it. Food barely came. Water was rationed. Medicine was a rumor. Hunger did not arrive slowly. It moved like a predator. The Union guards, fearing that the free people might spread diseases or wander into the city, forbade many of them from leaving the camp to find food. So they starved. And while the women and children waited behind those barricades, the men, already thin, already weak, were forced to work. Forced to chop trees, clear brush, cut timber under a sun that seemed to watch and not care. Imagine swinging an axe with no food in your stomach. Imagine digging the earth while your children waste away behind a wall you are not allowed to cross. This was freedom, but twisted. Freedom with no land. Freedom with no home. Freedom with no mercy. And then came the sickness. Smallpox. It moved through the camp like a shadow with hands. One day, someone would cough. The next day, they could no longer stand. By the third day, their skin burned with fever and sores, and then they were gone. But death did not leave when it came. It stayed. Bodies had to be buried where they fell. The soldiers would not allow them to leave the camp to bury their dead in proper ground. They were handed shovels and told, "Bury them where they drop." So the graves were shallow, the ground was thin, and the air was thick with the smell of rot and heat and grief. Some say thousands die. Some say tens of thousands. The truth, hidden by time and silence, may never be fully known. But what is known is this: people who had walked miles for freedom, people who had prayed and waited and believed, began to beg to go back to the plantations. "Turn me loose," they cried. "I'll go back to the fields, just not here, anything but here." Freedom had become a nightmare. The Devil's Punch Bowl did not just take lives, it took hope. By the time the camp finally dissolved in 1866, countless men, women, and children had died. Their names were not written, their graves were not marked, their stories were not told. But the earth remembers, the trees remember, the river remembers, and now we remember. There are so few voices left to tell this story. Most of the people who suffered in the Devil's Punch Bowl could not read or write. Not because they lacked the mind for it, but because slavery had made literacy illegal for them. So their words didn't make it into the books, their letters didn't fill archives. Their truth survived only in memory, passed down like a whisper through bloodlines and soil. But some voices did break through. One came from a man named James Yeatman, who visited the region during the war. What he saw shook him deeply. He wrote that dozens were dying each day. He begged the government, begged the president to intervene. But even in his plea disappeared into bureaucracy and distance, and the dying continued. Another voice came from someone who lived just above the pit, a young white girl named Lizzie Brown. From her family's home on the bluff, she could look down beneath the hill and see the camp. She wrote in her diary about the fragile shelters, shacks that looked like they could fall apart with a strong wind. She saw the shapes of men and women too weak to stand. She wrote of horrors that she was too young to fully understand, but old enough to recognize as wrong. Even from a distance, the suffering could not be hidden, but the voices that weigh the heaviest are the ones passed down, not written, but remembered. Local families told of how the people inside the pit cried out to be released, how their voices echoed against the canyon walls, anywhere but here. Think about that. They had survived slavery, they had survived the war, they had walked miles towards freedom, and now freedom had led them into a place so cruel. They begged to return to the very chains they escaped, and somewhere in that same pit, a Union guard was said to have muttered, "Even hell will be better than this." Not all stories from that time are simple. Not all memories are pure. Not all numbers agree. Some historians worry that parts of this tragedy were later twisted, stretched by bitterness, reshaped by politics, and colored by decades of silence and blame. But even when we strip away the myth, even when we avoid the inflated numbers, even when we question exaggerated claims, the suffering remains. Because no historian, not one, denies this. Thousands of freed black men, women, and children suffered in Natchez. Many died. Many were buried in unmarked earth. And their pain was not an accident of nature. It was the result of neglect, fear, and a nation unprepared to care for the very people it claimed to free. To the Union Army, they were often considered contraband. Not citizens, not families, not human beings with futures, just property transferred from one system of power to another. Freedom was given, but protection, dignity, and care were withheld, and that failure was lethal. This was the part of emancipation America rarely teaches, the part where victory did not look like celebration. It looked like hunger, it looked like sickness, it looked like unmarked graves beneath peach trees, it looked like a promise made and a promise abandoned. Today, if you walk the edge of the Devil's Punch Bowl, you won't see ruins, you won't see markers or gravestones or signs explaining what happened. You'll see green, thick, lush, almost beautiful green, vines, wild growth, and peach trees. Trees that bloom year after year, heavy with fruit. But in Natchez, nobody eats the peaches because the roots feed on unmarked graves, because the sweetness grows from blood and bone. It's a legend, yes, but legends are born from memory. And memory has a way of surviving where history refuses to be written. Sometimes when the Mississippi River rises, the banks swell and the mud loosens, and bones and human bones still wash out the earth, as if the land itself refuses to stay silent. Yet, for more than a century, almost no one spoke of this place. The history books glossed over it. The tour guides in Natchez talked instead about the old mansions, the grind pillars, the high ceilings, the romance of the Old South. They talked about elegance, but not about the pit of death beneath the hill. The lives lost in the Devil's Punch Bowl were not considered part of the history worth telling. The city remembered the wealth that slavery built, but not the people that freedom abandoned. It became easier to pretend this never happened, easier to polish the past than to confront it, easier to build museums for generals than memorials for the nameless. And so the memory of the Devil's Punch Bowl lived in whispers, in black families, in quiet conversations, and the kind of stories told in low voices late at night when the outside world has gone still. Only in recent years have people begun to dig, not just into the ground, but into the truth. Researchers, activists, descendants, people who refuse to let silence be the final word. Piece by piece, they rebuilt what was lost, not to shame, not to accuse, but to remember. Because this place is not just a tragedy, it is a lesson. Freedom is not just the moment the chains came off. Freedom needs shelter, freedom needs land, freedom needs protection, dignity, and care. Without those things, freedom can become another kind of suffering. The Devil's Punch Bowl reminds us that emancipation was not a clean ending. It was the beginning of a struggle that many did not survive. So when I stand at the edge of that pit, beneath the quiet breeze through the peach trees, I listen, because I know there are voices there, not loud, not angry, soft, tired, human. Remember us. This is all they ask. Not monuments, not marble statues, just remembrance. We honor them by speaking their names even when their names are lost, by telling their story even when history tried to bury it. Their blood watered these trees. Let their memory not wither like fruit left to rot on the branch. This story, this truth, is not here to make us comfortable. It is here to remind us of what freedom costs, what forgetting costs, and what remembering can heal. This is DiasUnite, where the story continues together.